Story: The Road to Greenfield. It was a cold autumn night, and I was driving towards Greenfield, a small town in Massachusetts, where my friend Ethan had recently moved. He always talked about how peaceful the place was, ideal for escaping the chaos of the city. Since I needed some time away from it all, I decided to spend the weekend at his house. The road seemed endless, cutting through dense forests that closed in around the car as I drove along. The GPS indicated that I had about 30 minutes left to reach my destination, but the cell phone signal was weak, and the darkness around me created a disturbing sense of isolation. The trees, tall and imposing, cast shadows that moved with the wind, making me feel even more uncomfortable. It was then that I spotted something on the shoulder of the road. My headlights illuminated the silhouette of a woman, standing there, alone, on the side of the road. She was wearing a white dress, which seemed out of place for such a cold night. Her face was partially covered by her hair, but I could see that she was looking straight at the car. My first reaction was to slow down. Maybe she needed help. However, as I got closer, a strange feeling came over me, as if something was terribly wrong. I drove past her slowly, trying to avoid her gaze. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone. My heart started beating faster, and a sense of panic set in. The road was deserted, and there was no way someone could just disappear like that. I decided to speed up and get to Greenfield as quickly as possible. When I finally got to Ethan's house, he noticed my expression and asked if everything was okay. I was reluctant to tell him what had happened, but the feeling of unease was so great that I finally did. To my surprise, he turned pale and asked if I had seen the woman in white. Ethan then told me a story that made me freeze. A few years ago, a woman had been run over on that very road. She was wearing a wedding dress, fleeing an arranged marriage, when a car hit her. Since then, locals have occasionally reported seeing a woman dressed in white on the side of the road, always disappearing without a trace. I couldn't sleep well that night. The image of the woman haunted me, and the idea that I might have seen something supernatural kept me on alert. The next day, I made sure to return home in the morning, but the road seemed different, less threatening in the daylight. Still, I couldn't get the vision out of my head. To this day, when I'm driving at night on deserted roads, I get a chill at the thought of seeing that woman again. Whether it was just a local legend or something truly unexplainable, I'll never know. But what happened on that road in Greenfield made me wonder what really lurks in the shadows. Story: The Coworker. When I started at my new company, everything seemed perfect. I had landed a well-paying job at a reputable tech firm in Chicago, and my coworkers were friendly and welcoming. Among them was a guy named Marcus, who stood out from day one. Marcus was a little older than the rest of the team, maybe in his 40s. He kept to himself, but he always had a friendly smile on his face and was willing to help. At first, he seemed like the kind of person you could trust. He had an easygoing, almost comforting manner, and he always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. The first few weeks went by without incident, but then things started to get weird. Marcus started making comments about my personal life, things I was sure I had never mentioned to him or anyone else at work. He knew about my apartment, details about the neighborhood, and even my personal tastes, like my preference for unsweetened coffee. At first, I thought maybe I had mentioned these things in casual conversation and simply forgotten about them. But then he started mentioning more specific details, like what time I went for a run or what route I took to work. He even knew about a scar on my shoulder, something I rarely mention. My sense of unease grew. I started avoiding Marcus, but he always found a way to get close. He would show up at the office coffee shop at the same time as me, sit next to me in meetings, and even start texting me outside of work hours, asking about my day or suggesting we meet for coffee. The texts started to get more personal. He would say things like, "I know what you did last night," or "That blue shirt you wore today looks great on you." That's when I realized something was really wrong. I decided to confront him, ask him how he knew so much about me, but he always brushed it off with a smile, saying it was just a coincidence. One day, after receiving yet another strange message, I decided to check the security cameras in my building. The building manager, who knew me well by now, let me review the footage. That's when I saw Marcus. He had been standing outside my building on several different nights, staring directly at the entrance. In one of the recordings, he was standing next to my car, as if he were waiting for me. My first reaction was to confront him again, but I soon thought better of it. I didn't know what he was capable of, and the idea that he had been watching me for so long filled me with dread. I decided to contact the police, but without any concrete evidence other than the videos, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be vigilant and to record any further suspicious behavior. Over the next few days, Marcus seemed to have sensed that I was suspicious. He became even more insistent, showing up in places I didn't expect, leaving notes on my desk, always with the same disturbing smile. I began to have trouble sleeping, worried that he might be waiting outside my house, watching me. Finally, I decided I had to get out of this situation. I quit my job and moved apartments, leaving behind everything that could connect me to my old address. I gave no information about my new place of work or residence to anyone who might somehow pass it on to Marcus. The next few months were difficult, but eventually, the feeling of being watched began to fade. Still, to this day, I can't walk past a coffee shop or park my car without looking around, afraid to see that smile again. What Marcus really wanted from me, I'll never know. But one thing is for sure, the feeling of being stalked never completely goes away. Story: The Inherited Object. When my grandmother passed away, I was tasked with organizing her belongings. She was a fascinating woman, full of stories and mysteries, and her home reflected that. It was an old house in New Orleans, filled with curious objects and memories accumulated over decades. As I rummaged through her closets and trunks, I found a small, hand-carved wooden box that immediately caught my eye. The box was intricately decorated, with symbols I didn't recognize and a rusty metal clasp. Inside, I found an antique pocket mirror, with an ornate handle and the glass a little cloudy with age. I vaguely remembered seeing my grandmother use it when I was a child, but she always said that the mirror was special and that it shouldn't be touched without permission. At the time, I thought it was just one of her superstitions, but now, holding the mirror in my hands, I felt a strange chill. I decided to take the mirror with me as a reminder of her. The first sign that something was wrong came that same night. I left the mirror on the nightstand next to my bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night feeling as if I was being watched. When I looked in the mirror, I thought I saw something moving across the surface, like a shadow, but it was too dark to be sure. I decided to ignore it and went back to sleep, but the discomfort persisted. Over the next few days, I began to notice a change in the atmosphere of my home. The place that had previously been my refuge began to become oppressive. Whenever I passed the mirror, I felt a strange presence, as if someone were there, lurking. I began to avoid it, keeping it in a drawer, but even so, the feeling of being watched would not go away. Then things started to get worse. I would wake up in the middle of the night with vivid nightmares, always involving the mirror and shadowy figures that seemed to watch me from afar. The reflection in the mirror, when I saw it, was not mine. It looked like someone older, with a look of terror in their eyes. Every day, the image became clearer and more disturbing. I tried to get rid of the mirror, but every time I thought about throwing it away, something stopped me. It was as if an invisible force prevented me from taking any action against it. When I finally decided to tell someone, I realized that I couldn't talk about it without feeling suffocated. It was as if the mirror was controlling my thoughts, isolating me. Finally, I sought help from an expert in ancient objects, someone who understood artifacts with history. He looked at the mirror and his expression changed immediately. He told me that the mirror probably had a connection to ancient divination practices, and that my grandmother, known for her occult knowledge, could have used it for purposes that left a mark on the object. He suggested a purification ritual, but warned that it might not work, depending on the intensity of the energy attached to the mirror. Desperate, I accepted his help, and together we performed the ritual. The energy in the house seemed to calm down for a while, but the mirror still disturbed me. I decided that the only solution was to return it to where it came from. I went back to my grandmother's house, which was now empty and for sale, and hid the mirror in one of the old trunks in the attic. I closed the house and left, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. Since then, I have never had nightmares about the mirror again, but I have also never returned to that house. I don't know what happened to the mirror, if a new owner found it, or if it is still hidden, waiting for someone to discover it. But whenever I think about it, I feel a chill down my spine, as if something, or someone, is still watching me, from a distance, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. Story: The house at the end of the street. Moving to a new city always brings a mix of excitement and anxiety. I was starting a new phase of my life in Richmond, Virginia, after accepting a job that seemed like an incredible opportunity. The neighborhood where I settled was quiet, made up of old, tree-lined houses with a nostalgic air that immediately won me over. The house I rented was one of those old buildings, with architectural details that harked back to the late 19th century. It had 2 stories, large glass windows and a covered porch that looked like something out of a classic movie. Despite its beauty, there was something about the house that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that it was a little far from the other houses on the street, or the deep silence that surrounded it, especially at night. In the first few days, I started to notice strange things. Sometimes, I would hear noises coming from upstairs, like light footsteps or furniture being dragged. I thought it might be the house settling down since it was old, or maybe rats in the attic. However, when I checked, I could never find anything that would explain the sounds. One night, while I was in the living room watching TV, I noticed a shadow moving in the kitchen, which was separated from the living room by a frosted glass door. I thought it was the reflection of the TV, but when I looked closer, I could clearly see the silhouette of a person standing there, as if watching me. My heart raced. I slowly got up and walked to the kitchen, but when I opened the door, no one was there. Things got worse when I started to notice objects moving around. The book I kept on the bedside table appeared on the couch, the keys I kept on the shelf were in the kitchen. I began to doubt my own memory, thinking that I was becoming careless due to the stress of my new job. But the feeling that something was wrong was inescapable. One night, I woke up with a strange sensation, as if someone was in the room. I opened my eyes and saw a figure standing in the corner, next to the window. The streetlights partially illuminated the face, revealing a sad, empty expression. I couldn't move, gripped by fear, as the figure simply watched me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it disappeared, as if it had never been there. The next day, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I discovered that many years ago, the house had belonged to a woman named Margaret, who lived alone after the death of her husband in the Civil War. She was known to be a loner, rarely receiving visitors, and spent her days tending to the house and garden. Margaret died in the house, and was reportedly found weeks later when neighbors noticed her absence. As I researched further, I began to understand that the presence I felt in the house was most likely that of Margaret. The feeling of sadness and loneliness seemed to permeate the walls. I decided I needed to do something about it, so I consulted a local historian, who suggested that I perform a small ritual to try to appease the spirit, leaving fresh flowers in the window where the figure had appeared. That night, I left a bouquet of white roses in the bedroom window. When I woke up, I felt the room feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The noises stopped, and I never saw the figure again. I still live in the house, and I always keep flowers in the window. I don't know if it was the gesture or just coincidence, but since then, the house has been peaceful. Sometimes I feel a light breeze passing through the room, like a grateful whisper, and I know that somehow Margaret has finally found rest.